So tonight we are going to do, does anybody know what an excursus is? I believe that's spelled correctly. What is an excursus? Has anybody ever heard that term?
Sounds like excursion.
It does sound like excursion, but we are not going to the Bahamas. We are definitely not going to the Bahamas. An excursus. Somebody look it up for me. I know you all got iPhones. You can do this in 2 seconds. I may not have spelt it correctly, so forgive me if I totally botched the spelling. I am a terrible speller. Tom is a very good speller. I am not a very good speller. Did I get it? Okay. Hey, all right. An excursus. This is your word for today. Going to be making you all great scholars before the night is over. I'm going to move over here like this. All right. Somebody read it. We got to tell everybody what it means.
A detailed discussion of a particular point in a book, usually in an appendix.
Okay. So this is the book we're going to be looking at tonight. Actually, it takes several forms because, it's been published and printed numerous times. This is the one I have, but I've got that one as well. So we're going to look tonight at Dr. King's letter from Birmingham jail. Who here has read this? Okay. All right. So you need to read this. It's not very long, as you can tell. I think I got this for like $6 or something. It's not expensive. It used to be, kind of with a number of other books, it used to be a required reading for most college freshmen, at least since 1963 when it was written. But for some reason we seem to have lost touch with the need to read books like this. So I do want you to promise me you'll go buy it and read it. And think about it. We're going to talk in length. We're going to do an excursus on it tonight. We're going to talk in length and in detail about some of the things that are in here. But just sort of off the top of your head, does anybody know what sort of the background behind this book, or where it came from, or what the context was in which it was written? The title kind of gives it away. But does anybody have any knowledge of the book or what was written in the letter?
Something to do with the civil rights movement, and
Okay.
In 1967, 66?
Well, he wrote it in 63 while he was in Birmingham City Jail. But yes, very much civil rights oriented. But one of the things, and today being MLK Day, I'm sure you've probably heard people talk about his legacy and the many books he wrote. I mean, this was one of his best writings ever. But one thing about this book, when we read it, when we go through this letter, you'll see that there's a couple of aspects of this that are really fascinating. Yes, it's about civil rights, of course, which was one of the main focal points, but it really is a lot more than that. There's a lot of very good, very deep theology and philosophy that's wrapped up in this letter that he wrote literally on scraps of paper or sitting in the jail while he was being jailed for, parading without a permit in Birmingham because the local authorities were trying to suppress the civil rights movement in Birmingham and in other cities. So this is a terrific book to read because it has a lot of Christian theology and philosophy wrapped up inside it. There are a number of references in the book that he makes about biblical, scriptural references from the Bible, also references from history, as well as philosophy, that really kind of capture everything that the civil rights movement was about. And that's why I say it's much broader than just the civil rights movement, although that was obviously one of the key focal points of it. He encapsulates so many different aspects of natural law. We'll talk about natural law theory and philosophy that'll go with this. So I want to try to keep it, since nobody's read it or very few people have read it, it'll be hard to do an excursus because generally you have to have read it first and then we talk about it, right? That's usually how an excursus works. But since that's not the case, we'll just talk about it. But I really do want you to read it. Go get a copy of it and read it. It's one of those should be on everybody's bookshelf because it is really that great a writing. Yes?
Is it a publicly language work? Like theoretically, could we like Google it and find it on?
Yeah, I think so. It is because it's part of the MLK library and part of their property. I don't know if you can download it for free. Have you guys ever tried to download it for free? Can you, or do you have to pay for it?
I found a PDF of it. I read it for class.
Okay, all right, okay. Well, there you go. So maybe you can.
And also, one year we did this, rather than going through it, we actually listened to the whole thing. If you go to YouTube, you can listen to Dr. King actually
Reciting it, yeah, reading it, yeah. Yep.
himself.
Yep. And so, yeah, I think it is available in a number of formats. I have a PDF version of it too, but I can't remember where I got it. But obviously I have the paper copies as well. So yes, it's very available. If you Google it or you search for it, it'll show up, yeah.
Okay, I'm confused. If MLK was reading his own letter, who was the letter for?
Well, we're going to talk about that. So let's talk about MLK's letter from Birmingham jail. Who was his letter to? Does anybody take a guess at who his letter was to? We'll see it in a minute because I'm going to show you the letter, at least the first page of the letter. The letter was actually addressed to clergy, pastors, ministers in many of the southern churches or churches in the southeast in the Atlanta and Birmingham area. It was actually written to clergy. Now that's interesting. Why would he be writing a letter to pastors about civil rights? I mean, wouldn't you, like, if the Birmingham police were violating your civil rights or oppressing you, wouldn't you write a letter to the mayor or the governor or the police chief or, right? Saying, no, this is wrong, you need to stop this. But he wrote the letter to a group of pastors. We're going to look at why that is. That's why this has such significant Christian relevance, because he actually wrote it to pastors. And we'll get to why that was. So here's the letter that a group of pastors wrote to Dr. King, which prompted this letter to be written while he was sitting in the prison, while he was sitting in the jail.
Were they white pastors or black pastors?
Both. And they were from multi-denominational. So it wasn't just one denomination. In fact, I thought I had the list here of, it's every major denomination you can think of. Baptist, Presbyterian, Lutheran, Catholic, Jewish, Hebrew, rabbis, and it was all different ethnicities and races, all different kinds. So it was very much focused on ministers, pastors, which again makes this letter very interesting to dissect and to sort of unpack as we talk about it. That's a good question. It wasn't just to any one particular group, it was across the board to pastors. So here's the letter that the pastors got together and wrote him this letter, and which prompted him to write his response. So his letter is actually a response to their letter, okay, if that makes sense. And of course, at the time, there was a lot of racial tension in the South in the 50s, and this was the early 60s. There were a lot of protests, a lot of sit-ins, a lot of social movements to try to raise awareness of the civil rights issues of the day, that Black Americans were not being afforded the same degree of civil rights freedoms as other people. And so because of the actions that they were taking, the group of pastors got together and said, hey, we're going to write MLK, we're going to write Dr. King a letter because we're not real happy about this, what we're seeing here. And you can kind of see I highlighted some stuff. I put some stuff in red circles. And they basically said, what you're doing is causing undue tension and friction. You're a rebel rouser. You're stirring up the hornet's nest. You're asking for trouble. Why are you doing this? Why are you making so much trouble? And in fact, they called his movement, his activities, and I see it here, untimely and unwise. That's the one near the bottom. Untimely and unwise. And we'll talk about why they said that. And they said that, while we understand that you have the freedom of speech and you can raise your view on things, we think the way in which you're doing it is not right. And so we're going to send you this letter telling you that we disapprove of the way you're doing it. Now, MLK was a pastor, right? You do know that. He was a pastor, Ebenezer Baptist Church, Atlanta, Georgia. So these were his peers, his colleagues, writing him a letter. So that would be like you getting a letter from your fellow students saying, hey, what you're doing is wrong, but not from the faculty or the staff or your fellow students writing you a letter and saying, hey, we think what you're doing is dumb, untimely, and unwise. So he was getting this letter from his peers, his peer pastors and clergymen, explaining that they thought what he was doing was not correct. And they say, we further strongly urge our Negro community to withdraw support from all of these activities because it's just causing too much strife, it's causing too much friction and tension, and it's not constructive. It's not going to accomplish what you want it to accomplish. And you can see, if you look at the names here, those were some of the pastors. I don't know if it was all of them, but you can see they're from a variety of different churches. Again, like I say, Baptist, Episcopal, you name it. A rabbi was in there, see the rabbi. So yeah, this was a number of clergymen in a number of different churches all across the Southeast. And they signed it and sent it to him. And he received a letter, and so now he's been arrested and he's in the jail. And he thought, well, I got plenty of free time on my hands. I'm going to go ahead and write a response to their letter and give them some understanding about what we're trying to accomplish here with this movement, this racial, social justice movement, this civil rights movement. And so this is the first part of his response. He says, while confined in the Birmingham City Jail, I came to access your letter. Actually, if I'm not mistaken, it was in the newspaper, right? These clergy had published the first letter I showed you in the newspaper. And so he read it in the newspaper, but it was essentially addressed to him and the civil rights movement, right? Because they were calling him out. And so he goes through and starts, and we're going to go through his response, right? Which is this. We're going to go through his response, and we're going to talk about the way in which he addressed and engaged with his fellow pastors, his fellow clergymen on the issue of civil rights in the 1960s. And we're going to look at some of the things he talked about and some of the ideas he was trying to communicate to them. And I mean, I think it is if you read it, it's really fascinating if you look at this. He says, seldom do I pause to answer criticism. But then he says, but since I feel that you are men of genuine goodwill and that your criticisms are sincerely set forth, I want to try and answer your statement in what I hope will be patient and reasonable terms. So interesting. Here's this group of pastors basically blasting him. And he takes this incredibly thoughtful approach to how to respond to them. He doesn't call them names. He doesn't, tweet that they're a bunch of jerks. He actually says, okay, you know what? I'm going to show charitable judgment. I'm going to assume your motives are pure, that you really want to understand why we're doing all of this civil rights activities. And so I'm going to try to describe this to you and explain it in reasonable terms, patient and reasonable terms. What a great way to engage. And again, as Christians, I think this is important for us to remember. So he's being attacked, and the civil rights movement is being attacked left and right. But yet he's calmly and thoughtfully engaging now, of course, this is a written response, but I think that's a great illustration of how we should engage people when we're talking to folks that maybe have a different view than we do about things, right? Maybe you meet someone who's not a Christian, or maybe they're an atheist, or maybe they're hostile to religion. King takes a wonderful approach, a very disarming approach, rather than just saying, no, you're a jerk and you don't know what. He's like, you know what? I'm assuming that you are raising good concerns. You're men of true, genuine, sincere will, and you want to understand what we're doing. And I'm going to do my best to explain this to you in thoughtful, reasonable, rational terms. What a great illustration that is for all of us, the way we engage people, the way we talk to people. And so he begins his letter with this exact approach. And the first criticism that they put on him is that, it's that, because now King's Church was in Atlanta, right? Ebenezer Church in Atlanta. But a lot of the civil unrest and the civil rights unrest was Alabama, Birmingham in particular, but also other ones, Selma. There were a number of very prominent places in Alabama. And in reading the letter, you see that Alabama probably was perhaps at the time one of the worst states, and Birmingham and Selma were some of the worst places for civil rights violations. So there was a lot of unrest going on in Alabama in the 60s. So King and his group come over from Atlanta to try to engage with what's going on with the civil rights leaders in Birmingham who were standing up, trying to stand up for their civil rights. And he goes on to really explain that just because they're not from Birmingham doesn't mean they can't engage in these discussions. They're not outside agitators. In fact, he says, no, we are all on the same mission. We're on the same quest to achieve the same goal, to raise awareness to the need for civil rights for this group of people that have been marginalized for centuries. And we are here constructively trying to engage Alabama, city of Birmingham, the police. And he goes on to say that we're here because there's injustice here. There is injustice in this city, and our job is to engage with it and raise the awareness of people so they can see it for what it is. And he goes on to describe his famous line, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. He's like, so look, anywhere there's injustice, people trying to seek justice should show up and try to engage with what they're seeing. It isn't just, well, only the people in Birmingham can engage injustices in Birmingham. That's kind of silly, right? I mean, like, if there was a major injustice going on in Raleigh, would we sit here in Wilmington and go, well, again, we're not really from Raleigh, I guess. Well, all right, I guess, okay, well, we're not going to do anything because it's not in our town. We're not in Raleigh, we're in Wilmington, so we're just going to sit here and do nothing. No, I would hope you wouldn't do that. I would hope you'd say, you know what? What's going on there is wrong. It's an injustice. We're getting in the car, we're driving 2 hours, and we're going to Raleigh to stand with the people who are trying to stand against that injustice. Just because we're not from Raleigh doesn't mean we can't engage with what's happening, right? And that's essentially what he was saying. He was like, a threat to justice anywhere threatens justice everywhere. If we allow that injustice to propagate, well, guess what? It might make its way to Atlanta one day, or Charlotte, or Raleigh, or somewhere else. And so his taking it, yes?
But doesn't that logic fall apart when you go to like other nations? For example, like Russia and Ukraine, the war in Iraq.
Right.
Is there a sort of, couldn't you debate that there's some sort of ethical limit to whether or not you respond to the justice everywhere?
Yeah, so he does talk about the United States here. He talks about the United States because in the United States, we all live under the U.S. Constitution. So we should all be afforded equal protection under the law. But yes, now you go to North Korea, guess what? They don't have the 14th Amendment in North Korea, right? They violate civil rights every day. So that you would take a different approach with that because that is a different culture. They don't have the same laws we do. They don't have the same form of government. But he specifically talks about the United States here. And in fact, I think if you read one of the sentences says that anybody who lives in the United States is a citizen of this country, is afforded those protections. So he is focusing on the U.S. and particularly constitutional rights that are afforded under the U.S. Constitution, right? And that was part of his big concern was that some groups of citizens, Black Americans, were not being afforded equal protection under the law. They weren't being given the right to a speedy trial. They weren't being afforded the same civil rights as other Americans. And he was like, hey, we're Americans. How come we're not being afforded these same protections, right? And so that was sort of the basis for why they were raising these concerns, these civil rights or justice concerns. And he goes on a little bit to talk about yes, we understand that demonstrations can be risky, can be tricky. Sometimes things can be troublesome or difficult. But he goes on to say, but it's not without merit because the real issue is the things that led to the need for these protests in the first place. They're not just protesting for their health. There's a reason they're protesting. And so he makes it a point to say, look, if this is the approach we in the civil rights movement have taken to try to engage with the concerns we have. And it's really fantastic when you read this, because he's like, he literally lays out step by step the process they take. It's like, it's very formulaic. It isn't just, hey, we're just randomly going to do something. He actually lays out step by step, here's how we do this. So we're not being random, we're not being irrational, we're not just lighting buildings on fire for the fun of it. We are taking a prescribed, measured, ordered, structured way of approaching this problem. And he goes through step by step, and he explains each one of these. He talks about step one, collection of the facts. Does injustice exist? Or does it just appear that injustice exists? Is there really injustice going on? Are people's civil rights really being violated? Are black people being treated differently than white people? Collect the facts. Second, if it is concluded that there are injustices, then engage in discussion, engage in negotiation with the city leaders, with the state leaders. Try to understand how this can be reconciled. Third step, he talks about self-purification, this is a fascinating one, and we'll get into it in a minute. How they, and this is something that I think he got this from his biblical Christian upbringing. I know scripturally we are instructed if we have a grievance with another believer, right, that we are to what? Before we engage with them, what are we commanded to do in Scripture? Does anybody know?
Take the log out.
Yes, we are to look at ourselves first. We're supposed to look at ourselves, take the log out of our eye before we take the speck out of theirs. Self-reflection, self-purification. Have I done anything wrong? Have I done anything to precipitate this? Am I at fault in any way? Am I acting in a sinful way somehow? Before you start beating up other people, look in the mirror and see, where are you in this process? Self-purification. And we're going to talk about, again, what that looks like for their process here. And then the final one, this is the one that gets all the publicity, is the direct action. Now notice it doesn't say, violent protest. It says direct action, meaning rather than just sitting and writing letters, you actually get up and do something. You go on a march, you stage a sit-in, you protest in some way peacefully, but you take direct action. And that's the last step, and that's the one that, of course, has been causing all the consternation with the local leaders, right? But he goes through and he describes each one of these. So collection of the facts, does injustice exist? Negotiation, they determined that, yes, injustice did exist. People's civil rights were being violated. They weren't being treated the same as other citizens. They tried to negotiate in good faith, but they were the victims of broken promises. A lot of this has to do with the facts. At the time they would have, and I'm sure you've seen these, white-only bathrooms, black-only. At the time they called it Negro-only bathrooms, white, drinking fountain, Negro drinking fountain, right? So that was one of many things that they were trying to get changed. Because they thought it was very dehumanizing, right, to African Americans, to blacks, to black Americans. And the city made a few promises to fix things, but then it never actually got fixed. The signs went back up, months later. Actions that they said were going to happen never really happened. And so he says, as it turns out, we were victims of a broken promise. So negotiation didn't cut it, right? So then they went to this self-purification. And they actually had workshops on how to peacefully engage in direct action protests. And they actually had workshops where they would teach their group, their followers, how to not retaliate if somebody was attacking you or sicking dogs on you or hosing you with a fire hose. I'm sure you've seen films of this, like black and white films from the 60s. It's pretty horrendous, some of the things that they had to endure. because they were staging protests. So can they take blows without retaliating? Can they peacefully protest? Are they willing to go to jail for what they're doing? Right? I'm sure you've heard of Rosa Parks. What did she do?
She refused to give up her seat on the bus.
And what happened to her?
She got jailed.
You bet. She got sent to jail. Why did she get sent to jail?
I think it's because is it because she refused to move? Is it because of the reason she gave? Is it because?
So it was against the law. There were city ordinances, laws that said black people there, white people here. And
She was sitting in the white section.
you bet.
She refused to give up her seat.
So she was breaking the law. And we're going to talk about that. Are there times when it's okay to break the law? We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the nature of law. This is why King's letter is so awesome. Is it okay to break the law? Obviously, most of the time, I hope we would say, no, we should follow the law. But are there times when you should stand against the law? Is it possible there could be laws that are, in their very nature, unjust? And how do we tell the difference between an unjust law and a just law? And he gives us some really good illustrations of how you do that. And so they had to be able to endure a lot of punishment, getting sent to jail without a speedy trial, without legal representation. And they had to be able to accept that fate, knowing that they broke the law and they were going to have to pay the penalty for that. But that was part of their direct action program. And then, of course, ultimately, this led to direct action, which is, again, not just tweeting, you're a jerk, but actually getting up and doing something. Actually walking and protesting and marching and sitting and taking somebody's seat when you're not supposed to and being sent to jail for it and marching in a place that you're not permitted to march because of some city ordinance or city law that didn't permit you to do that because of the group of people that you are associated with. Really interesting things that were going on at this time. And so King goes on in his letter to say that this is actually a good thing. Creating tension is a good thing. Because remember, the pastors were like, man, you're just making too much trouble. You're a rebel rouser. Stop creating so much difficulty. You're just why are you such a troublemaker? You're creating too much tension. And King responds to this in his letter and says, you know what? That's actually a good thing, creating tension, raising awareness of an injustice by creating, in his case, it was social tension, right? Because they were doing things that were violating the social structure of Birmingham or other cities. And he makes references to how Socrates engaged with individuals of his time, creating intellectual tension, social tension. What was Socrates known for, aside from being like famous philosopher? Like what made him so famous? Does anybody know what made him? And Christian, you can't answer because I know you know the answer. Like, what was he so famous for? Why was he such a big household name, even to this day? I mean, the guy lived like over 2,000 years ago, and most people have still heard of him. What was he known for? It's in his name. Okay, what method was he known for eventually popularizing?
The Socratic.
Okay, and what is the Socratic method?
I think it's like a process of examining and asking questions.
Okay, yes.
Or to like go to the base idea. I mean, he had a group of pupils like Aristotle and Plato,
Yep.
and would engage with them in discourse in order to get to the real meat of the idea.
Okay.
And I think it was supposed to be a direct response to solipsism.
Yes, solipsism, yep. And how does engaging in dialogue do that? Like questions and answers. This is kind of like what we do in Christianity with apologetics. How do we engage people who don't believe what we do? Do we just call them jerks and walk away? We just take our coffee and pour it over their head and walk away? How do we engage them? What do we do? How do you engage an unbeliever? Talk to them. Ask them questions. Why do you think God doesn't exist? Do you have any evidence for that view? Do you know anybody else who holds your view? Why do they think God doesn't exist? What if God didn't exist? What would the implications of that be? What if God did exist? What would the implications of that be? And engage in discussion with people who have a different view than you do. Clearly, people had a different view than Dr. King. A lot of people had a different view than him. And so he was creating tension in the minds of the leaders of the South, bringing to their attention the fact that these injustices were happening. The term is a gadfly. Have you ever heard the term gadfly? Does anybody know what a gadfly is? We'll let Christian answer it if nobody knows, because I know he knows what it is. But this is a term that is used a lot, a gadfly. Y'all are going to have like the best vocabulary in the world when we're done here tonight. All right, Christian, give it to us. Yep. Yep. And has anybody ever had a deal with a horsefly? They're like, and they're like, and they bite you, and you're like, right? They're annoying. They're tormenting you. Like, leave me alone. I'm going to go somewhere to get away from you because you're driving me nuts. That's a gadfly. Now, again, we're not trying to be rude or obnoxious, but we're asking questions. We're engaging. We're making you uncomfortable because I want to test your view. I want to understand why you think God doesn't exist, or why you think it's okay for black people to have their civil rights violated. Like, I want to engage you with tension in the mind so that you have some idea of why you think the way you do, and hopefully, by asking questions, I'll help you see that your view has some problems with it. And we can discuss those. We can talk about those. So the idea of a gadfly, right, that annoying fly, like a horsefly, that is constantly buzzing around and it's not going to kill you, right? It's not going to kill you. It's a fly. But it's going to be a nuisance. It's going to be annoying. And that's kind of how we have to view when we engage with people that don't share our view. Again, we're not trying to be rude. We're not being obnoxious. But we're just asking questions. Following up on the questions. And that's what King is talking about here. He's trying to engage them to see if they can explain, why do you have these city ordinances that a black woman can't sit in the white section? That doesn't seem right, does it? Like, where'd that come from, right? How do we get here? And so that's what he's talking about. And then he goes on to talk about the nature of justice. And again, there's a lot of famous quotes in here, so I've tried to highlight some of them. His famous justice, too long delayed is justice denied. He goes on to talk about, he does a really good job talking about history. This guy, I mean, must have had like incredible knowledge of so many things. He talks about history and the United States and the founding of our country and the basis of the foundation of our country and the rights that we have. And his point is basically, yes, the principles of the country are wonderful, but the way it's being practiced is not living up to what the principles should be. Black citizens, black Americans have been waiting hundreds of years to have the equality that many other people have. I mean, I'm not sure how much you all have studied the 1960s. It's a fascinating generation. But like, if you were a black person and you were injured in a car accident, and there was a hospital right down the street for white people, and the closest black hospital was 20 miles away, you got taken to the black hospital, even if you might die along the way, because you're not going to the white hospital. There were hotels that said whites only. People slept in their car when they were traveling across country because they couldn't find a hotel for Negroes, for black people. I mean, it's amazing to look at this time in American history when you look at the things that were going on. And he gives numerous examples of this. I'm not going to be able to do it all justice now. But he's talking about the nature of the civil rights violation, and yes, the racism that existed at the time. And I mean, he says we've waited 340 years, basically since the beginning of the United States, to have these equal rights applied to us, and we still don't have them after 3.5 centuries of time. And so he really starts to build what I think is a very, very good argument for his case. Then he goes and starts talking about the nature of law. Now, I am not an attorney. Tom is an attorney. Tom can answer all your legal questions. But he talks about the nature of just and unjust laws. Because you got to remember, Rosa Parks was arrested for breaking the law. The king and his followers were arrested for breaking the law. They weren't allowed to parade or have a sit-in in that one location because there was a city ordinance or a law against it. So they got put in jail. They got put in jail for breaking the law. And some of the criticism levied against King and his followers were, well, here you are talking about wanting to have justice and equality, but you're breaking the law. How can you justify your actions? You're not even following the law yourself. You're a lawbreaker. How do you justify following some laws and not following others? Doesn't that seem kind of contradictory? Here you are trying to achieve racial social justice, civil justice, and yet you're breaking the law. What do you think about that? Is it okay to do that? Is it okay to break the law? I mean, we're supposed to follow the laws of our country. Has anybody ever heard of the concept of the reformer's dilemma? Anybody know what that means? Or anybody ever heard of that? Reformer's dilemma. What do you think it means? What do you think it is trying to communicate? The reformer's dilemma. What do you think? Were King and his followers reformers? Were they trying to reform society, civil society? Yeah, they were. So what was their dilemma? What was their dilemma? What's that?
Breaking certain laws.
Yeah. How can you be a reformer and yet you're breaking the law at the same time? And that is a characteristic of what is known as the reformer's dilemma. Sometimes when systems are unjust, you actually have to break the law to fix the law. Which seems kind of contradictory at first, because we're not supposed to break laws, right? We're supposed to obey laws. Good citizens obey laws. We don't go around breaking laws. But there can be times when if a system is unjust, it's actually good and it's actually morally right to break a law with the ultimate goal of fixing the unjust system and having a law that is just. Does that make sense? Right? So, and he talks about the difference between just laws and unjust laws. He quotes all kinds of famous Christian writers, Augustine, Aquinas. Oh my gosh, this is such a great letter. But he talks about the nature of law and just laws and unjust laws. And then he goes in to talk about what's the difference between a just law and an unjust law. Yeah, again, I'll let you read it for yourself because you're all going to go home and get a copy of the book or the PDF. But I want you to read it. And he talks about the basis for determining if a law is just or unjust. Like laws are made by humans. Yeah, we have laws. We have we had a speed limit law, and every year I got to pay my taxes. Otherwise, I go to jail. Right? There's laws. Right. So we have laws that are man-made, human-made laws. What is the basis for those laws? Like, why do we have a law that says you got to pay your taxes? Why even have a law for that? Or why do we have a speed limit law? Like, hey, don't drive 90 miles an hour in a school zone. Like, why do we have a law for that? What's the basis for laws?
Collective human flourishing.
Okay, so that would be what do you call it? Like a utilitarian view. So if I were Adolf Hitler, I would say, yeah, you know what? Let's make a law to get rid of all these Jewish people, so we'll have more resources for the Germans, and that will promote collective human flourishing for the German people. Would that be justified? Because that's exactly what Hitler did.
No, because the law is also meant to uphold just and moral behavior.
Okay, so can we use the ends justifies the means as the basis for law? I mean, Hitler did. Hitler basically said, yep, we're going to do that. Yeah.
Hitler was wrong.
Well, okay. So human flourishing probably isn't a good basis for a law, because human flourishing could exist and something be wrong, be morally wrong. So how do we determine if it's wrong, if it's not human flourishing? If human flourishing isn't the ultimate basis for law?
There needs to be an absolute standard.
Okay, now where do we get that from? Where do we get a standard from? Because apparently we can't all agree on human flourishing. Because Hitler thought, hey, human flourishing is great for the Germans and the poor Jewish people. Well, it didn't work out so well for them, right? So how do we get a standard that above the standard?
But Hitler was wrong, so wouldn't that just be a bad law rather than a bad means?
Correct, it would be a bad law, but why is it a bad law?
Because it didn't achieve objective human flourishing.
No, it did achieve objective human flourishing. The Germans flourished wonderfully, imprisoning all those people. They had slaves working night and day, digging tunnels, building forts, building runways, building battleships, building tanks. The Germans flourished.
But not collectively.
Well, as far as Hitler was concerned, that collective was German, was the country of Germany. As far as they were concerned, that was human flourishing, right, for them. And could Hitler get other countries to agree to that? Like, what do you mean by collective human flourishing? Like the whole world?
Depends on if you're having federal laws, that would be the entire nation.
Okay.
You
So,
have global laws.
so let's take the United States. There was a time in this country when 95% of the people enslaved 5% prior to the Civil War. That produced a lot of collective flourishing for our country. We had farms, we had cotton production, we had tobacco, we had all kinds of stuff. Is that produced collective flourishing for people of this country? Was that a just law?
During the height of Southern slavery, many states had more black people than did white people.
Okay, but I'm talking about the country as a whole. Country as a whole. Country as a whole. Because you talked about country as a whole, right? Country as a whole.
But those were state laws, not federal laws.
Well, yes. So was it good for the state of North Carolina?
No, because North Carolina had a majority black, and so that was collective.
So is it okay then for people to enslave other ones for collective flourishing?
No, that would be a bad law.
Okay. So why is it a bad law?
Other than it being immoral,
Well, so when you say it's a bad law, you're putting a value judgment. You're imposing where are you getting that value judgment from? What's the basis for why it's a bad law?
on a personal level, slavery is wrong.
That's for you, but what if somebody else liked it? I mean, the white slave owners loved it.
Right, but many people have different standards, and so
Okay.
when it comes to
Yes.
national
Yes.
state level laws, it is often objective human flourishing that is meant to be achieved.
But is that a good basis for a law?
No, but only because we don't trust people to do the right thing.
Okay. Human nature is fallen. I think Christianity would tell us that. So there has to be something beyond humans to establish the basis for the law, because humans screw up a lot and come up with really dumb ideas a lot. So what is that standard above humanity that we would point to? Since we all can't seem to agree, Hitler wants to do one thing, Mussolini wants to do something else, We can't seem to come up with a collective law that we can all agree with. How do we determine right and wrong? King had an answer. His answer was that there is a law above the law that is the basis for all laws. So why do we not allow people to drive 90 miles an hour in a school zone? What's the fundamental principle that is being upheld, not letting people drive 90 miles an hour in a school zone? Safety. And safety of human life is worth protecting. Human life is worth preserving. Kindergartner life is worth protecting. We seem to agree that there's a basis that human life is worth protecting. Why don't we steal why do we file our taxes? Why do we not steal and file a false tax return? What's the basic principle at work for why we don't cheat on our taxes?
The IRS would catch you.
That's a pragmatic concern. But why is it wrong? Why is it wrong? What's the fundamental precept at work here? I'll give you a hint. Thou shalt not steal. Right? There are fundamental precepts that are the basis for all laws. And if you think about it, you can think of any law you can come up with. There is a foundational basis for that, based on a law above the law. That is the bedrock principle for why we don't drive 90 miles an hour in a school zone. That is what King was pointing to. And he was saying, look, there is a law above the law. And so when Rosa Parks sat in the back of the bus or refused to give up her seat to a white man, that law that she broke was an unjust law. And it's okay to break an unjust law. Yes?
What should we do with scriptures, like when we're told in the New Testament it says, slaves, obey your masters, even when they're unjust. And then I believe in one of Peter's epistles, he tells us to obey the emperor in all things, good or bad.
Right. So again, slaves, we've got to be careful with the terminology. So that in scriptural references, those are indentured servants, okay. Not chattel slavery, like we're accustomed to today, talking about today from the U.S. history in the mid-19th century. But yes, I mean, that in scriptural reference, the owner is responsible for that indentured servant, right? And their actions.
To push back against you, I think we also see examples of civil disobedience in Scripture, like
Yes.
Shadrach, and Mishael in the book of Daniel.
Well, in fact, King talks about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in this letter. He talks about them. What did they do? Yeah, boy, they broke a law. They broke the biggest law of all. They didn't worship the king when they were commanded to.
Didn't they break that law precisely because God told them to?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas we don't have that direct revelation to us.
Well, I would argue we do. It's called the Bible.
But the New Testament tells us to obey our masters when they're cruel and to obey the emperor in good or bad things.
And that's where you've got to make an assessment of, is the law just or is it unjust? Like if there was a law that said you should help somebody rob a bank, would you help somebody rob a bank? Or would you say, no, that's not a just law because you're not supposed to steal? I hope you would say we're not supposed to steal, right? That would be an unjust law, yes.
But didn't Jesus himself break the law?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely, because the law was unjust. It was not a just law. Man-made laws are not always just.
But I'm confused. Isn't the commandment to rest on the Sabbath and the specific law, that was a God-made law, that shall keep the Sabbath holy, and he broke that law.
Right, and how was that being implemented in human terms? How was it being implemented? And King talks about this in his letter. I'm telling you, got to get this book. King talked about that. Laws can be just or unjust, but they can also be applied in an unjust or just way. And in that case, they were applying it in an unjust way, even though the law is just. Like I think King uses the example of there's a law that says you can't parade without a permit. Okay, so he's like, okay, I understand there's a law you can't parade without a permit, but that law was being used to accomplish an unjust end, which was to violate people's civil rights. And so he would say that even though the law itself is just, the application is unjust, and therefore you should stand against it. Yeah.
So nowhere real quick.
Yeah, please.
It's like Romans 13 where it says to be subject to the government and to fear it. Because as a sort of us is like Paul says the point of the government is to reward good and punish evil. So if we find ourselves in a situation where it's rewarding
Evil, yes.
good,
Yep.
then we'd say it's not.
A just law.
Like it says,
Yep.
Paul uses super strong language, and it might seem at first like he's saying like obey the law and everything. Like it says like this is God's servant, God has put it in places, put his ministers here. But then it says the point is to reward good and punish evil. So once
Right.
the government is not doing that,
Correct.
it's not doing its job.
To further that point, we are still subject to earthly authorities and kingdoms. And so I think it's important when we are being exercising civil disobedience, we are still subject to the consequences that will come.
Y'all need to get this book because King talks exactly about that. He talks exactly about, please get this book. In fact, you know what? Send me your email. I'll buy it for you because I so want you to read this because he talks exactly about that. And in fact, he says people that knowingly break a law because it's unjust, but suffer the consequences like being put in jail, actually show the highest regard for the law. They're actually holding the law in the highest possible regard because they are knowingly breaking something that goes against their conscience, that goes against the moral law, but they're willing to pay the consequences, be put in jail. And that person actually shows the highest regard for law. I'm telling you, this thing is just wonderful to read. So there is all kinds of discussion like that in his book, in his letter, that is great to read. But yes. So if you are protesting something like an abortion clinic because you think it's wrong to murder babies, which, yeah, I agree with, it's wrong to murder babies, and you get arrested and put in jail, you are actually demonstrating the highest regard for the law because you are knowingly facing the consequences for something that you're choosing to do because you're violating God's moral law or your conscience. Yeah, somebody have a hand? Tom, do you have a hand?
Yeah, and I think there's a tension in Scripture too, because the audiences, Romans, and I think in one of Peter's epistles, are to Christians that are undergoing persecution, right? So there's a tension between pushing back against ungodly laws and then through your life submitting to authority, and then that in some sense is a witness to the gospel in submitting to unjust authority. So it's not a black and white, this law contradicts the Bible, so we need to go march or we need to go sit in. Sometimes, maybe in the case of the unborn, you push back, and then other times you act humbly because you're submitting to authority and you're praying for, Peter says pray for your leaders, which, I guess it was, I don't know if it was Nero at the time that he was writing, but they're undergoing persecution, and yet they're commanded to pray for their leaders rather than to march around the palace.
Right, yeah.
Didn't Jesus also say, give to
Caesar what is Caesar's, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's.
And wasn't the entire point of the Messiah is that everyone thought the Messiah would be like, yay, they're going to liberate us from the Romans, and he didn't.
Correct.
Do that.
Correct.
He was peaceful, and he was just taught obedience, which I guess it means that you have to pay your taxes and stuff like that. So I guess.
As Christians, I would hope that we would show the highest regard for law. Of all the groups of people out there, I would hope that we would be the best example of a law-abiding citizen. We don't want anarchy. We should be the model example of that. But there can be times when the law is unjust. It doesn't happen often, but it can be. And that's when we have to engage in culture. Yeah.
Can I read from Romans 13?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
It says in 13 verse 1, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. So is this a blanket statement, would you say, or do you think that there are exceptions that are that are not outlined?
So I would say humans are sinful. God puts leaders in place, but people have free will and make sinful choices. And when they make sinful choices like laws that violate people's civil rights, it's our duty to stand against that.
So this is not a blanket statement?
Correct. I would say that the assumption is that all the laws that the leader makes would be just, but I don't think that's always a good assumption. Because we know in history there have been many laws that have not been just, but yet God has appointed that leader. People have free will. People make bad decisions. This one right here makes bad decisions that because of my free will. I do things that God would not approve of because I'm a sinner, just like we all are, right? So I think that's part of the nature of this, the human nature of it. Yeah.
So, what's the difference between the philosophy between the Bible saying that God appoints human leaders and say the Chinese mandate of heaven, which says that the mandate of heaven. I'm sorry, I'm just confused because it just reminds me because basically they justified overthrowing their government, saying that if we succeed in throwing our government, that means that God will is on our side and they don't listen to the old government.
Right.
Just failing to understand, like, what if, let's say, an unjust leader in like the Western world, like Putin or someone else, took over an established God government? So did God establish, like, I don't know?
Well, I would say I would have a little difficulty with God ordaining a communist leader coming in and taking over a free country.
Yeah.
Maybe he would, but
So,
that Christian, you got your hand up. Go ahead.
Well, I thought just go for what Jack was saying. I think sort of like I would say we need to like finish the clause with the verse which is for rulers cause no fear for good conduct, but for bad. And it says on do good and you'll be committed for it. You only fear because you've broken the law.
Right.
Which I do think that has the assumption that like this ruler has good law, like only has just law. Because even internally, Paul certainly cannot be thinking that the government is, with the Roman government, is completely just.
Yeah. I'm sure he
He
is.
suffered persecution when writing this letter. I believe like this would have been like pretty soon after he was mistaken for not being a Roman citizen. But so I do think like that he's assuming that there is a just law in place. Then like we have to follow. I wouldn't say that he's blanket stating that all rulers are good. Otherwise, we kind of got to throw out the whole New Testament, right? Or Old Testament, because so much of the Old Testament is just civil complaining.
Right.
Like Nahum is a complete rant against Assyria for the decisions of their rulers. Obadiah is a judgment on the Edomites for the decisions of their rulers. And all throughout Israel's kings, Israel's history of its own kings, it's like you have 3.5 good kings. and all the rest are a huge mix of good and bad. So to take Paul as meaning like, oh yeah, the ruler is always making just laws. I think we have to like question, okay, so where did all this Old Testament background and all this sort of stuff.
Yeah. Good.
It seems that verse 3 is not meant to be a clause on the previous commandment, but rather an expansion or explanation of why Paul writes the commandment. And also, if he is not trying to say at all that the Roman covenant is good, because he clearly understands that it's not.
Yeah.
Would this not strengthen the idea that it is a blanket statement because he's specifically writing to those who are persecuted by the church, or persecuted by the Roman state? If he's telling them still obey the state. It could be a translation thing. Mine just has like a comma for rulers cause no fear for good conduct or for bad. So that could be. It could be a Greek thing. There aren't sentences in Greek, which is frustrating. At least it's not the way we have them. Yeah. But I mean, I would say like if you were to just play this outright, Paul doesn't believe that the Roman government is going to reward you for not obeying the civil gods, right? It's not worshiping or the emperor, which would have been mandatory by law.
this passage is very confusing. It would kind of be out of place. So I think it's just laying out what the point of a government ruler is. But I think it's like it's saying to obey it 100%. Otherwise, he'd be telling Christians to worship the emperor,
Right.
which would be interfering.
That would be blasphemy, yeah.
But would the exception only be when it comes to a direct commandment from God not to do something? Whereas in the instance of the Civil Rights Act, there was a very good, not a good time, but it was a very good movement to push for civil rights. It was not by direct commandment of God. I mean, we see allusions to many forms of equality in the New Testament. And many parts of the Old was, I mean, Israel was a rather progressive state itself, but when it comes to the idol worshiping, I don't know if that's a comparable example because we have direct command from God not to do that.
So you're saying, like, we could disobey civil laws if there's a direct commandment from God, but not necessarily didn't have a direct commandment.
Like if there was a law for murder,
Yeah.
we shouldn't do that because we have higher authority. But if there is a law for something else by which we have no higher authority, then it seems that God has told us to subject ourselves to the rulers because there is no higher authority over us.
So I think that is to misunderstand what a law is. So like the point of the civil law is to enforce the moral law. And the moral law only exists insofar as it's built upon the eternal law of God's nature. So if we do know the moral law, then we do know God's will. There isn't a question in which we don't know God's will. I would say sometimes it might be difficult on moral questions. On moral questions, we do basically know God's will, but we basically know whether a civil law is just or unjust based upon it.
Couldn't it be argued that in the second great commandment about loving your neighbor as yourself, that's where the civil rights laws were contradicting what God has already said? So, yeah, I'd probably have to look at the context of Romans. It seems like Paul's addressing something a little more specific rather than making a
Yeah, universal.
obey every leader because every leader has been put in place by God. Clearly, Nebuchadnezzar was put in place by God. The prophet said to Israel, hey, if you don't cut it out, Babylon's going to overtake you. So Babylon was used by God to punish them, and yet it seems like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were lauded for their
Disobeying.
civil disobedience
Right.
there. So I think we'd stop short of saying that the Hebrew boys violated the spirit of Romans 13. So I don't know. My argument would be Paul's probably addressing something a little more narrow than a universal.
I'm executing this in real time. The context immediately before Paul is talking about not repainting evil with evil, which seems to be in the context of like believers, relation to people, but he does spend about 5 verses before this about not repainting evil with evil. So I do wonder if maybe Christians, there's still a strain that was within the Jewish, those beforehand, like we're going to overthrow this government eventually through the Messiah. Like I don't know that this exhortation to obey the government comes right after this where God says, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay." If you're hungry, thirsty with drink, eat burning coals upon his head. So I do wonder if there was this strain in the early church of like somehow we're going to take down Rome by force or otherwise. I don't know. That's not completely clear here, but it is. I never noticed that before until this discussion that this exhortation to the government is coming right after saying not to repay evil with evil, and we know just from the context the government is doing evil to the early church.
I'd like to further add to this conversation, the word subject, the Greek word for it, is repeated multiple times throughout scripture. And a notable one is essentially the word for subject is also used to say the demons are subject to God's will. And that doesn't mean the demons are perfectly obeying God's law, right?
They're demons.
But it does mean that when God is bringing down consequence for their actions, they have no choice but to submit to what, consequences befall them and, God's will. So, furthermore, when it says we're subject to authorities, it doesn't necessarily mean to obey them perfectly. I think it means to accept the consequences
Right.
that's being doled out because of your actions.
Right.
I'll shut mine.
No, it's good. No, you're good. These are good questions. They're very good. I don't want to keep you too long, but okay, so King goes through and actually lays out aspects of a just law and obviously an unjust law, so you can see the differences between them. And these are the major points he makes, and this comes right out of his letter. A moral law, a just law, is one that squares with God's moral law. One that a majority compels the minority to follow, but also follows it themselves. That's an important one. A law will be unjust if the minority had no part in devising or enacting the law. So at the time, the laws that were on the books were voted on by the people in the state of Alabama, and they said, yep, we're going to vote on these laws, and we're not going to let black residents go here and do this. But guess what? The black residents didn't get a chance to vote on it because they had laws on the books that said you have to be a landowner in order to vote. And many of them were not landowners. So they couldn't vote. And so whenever anybody said, well, we got a law right here that says, black people at the back of the bus, the black people didn't have a chance to vote on it because there was an unjust law that said you had to be a landowner in order to vote. And in fact, he gives a great example in here. There were some counties in Alabama where like 90% of the population were black and 10% were white. And yet laws for civil and racial injustice were on the books because 90% of the people didn't vote for it because they couldn't vote, right? So unjust if the minority had no part in devising or enacting the law. That was a big deal because most of these civil statutes, civil laws, were voted upon by all the white people, not any of the black people. And it can be unjust, it can be just on its face, but unjust in its application. And I think we talked about that a minute ago. The law or the ordinance that said you can't parade without a permit. And the reason they did that was because they didn't want the civil rights activists to protest. And they said, oh, you're violating the law. You can't protest. Where's your permit? Oh, you don't have a permit? Sorry, you can't march here. Now, there's nothing wrong with needing a permit to have a sit-in or a march. But when it's used to accomplish something that's unjust, like preventing people from exercising their civil liberties or obtaining their civil liberties, then it's an unjust law. So it can be just on its face, but unjust in how it's applied. And again, you got to read the book. You got to read the letter to see that he gives so many great examples. But it's just really interesting to read the examples he gives. He also gives examples of what he calls distortions of the law. And these are some of the examples that I just mentioned about a law being just on its face and unjust. Some laws appeared to be moral or ethical, but yet they were used to maintain segregation. They were used to maintain unjust segregation laws. And then he goes on to use a really interesting illustration. He says, we should remember that everything Adolf Hitler did in Germany was legal. It was legal. So this was legal in Germany in the 1930s and the early 40s. Does anybody know what laws were passed in Germany that made this legal?
The Nuremberg law?
Nuremberg laws. It made that legal. This was a serious problem because at the end of World War II, when it was discovered all this was going on, and they were putting the Nazi war criminals on trial, they had a serious problem. The Allied forces, the lawyers trying to prosecute the case, because they didn't do anything illegal under German law. They couldn't prosecute them under American law because none of them are American citizens. They couldn't prosecute them under Russian law because none of them are Russian citizens. And under German law, this was legal. So I guess they were not guilty? What's the basis for convicting them of war crimes if everything they did was legal? What do you do? What were they convicted of? Does anybody know? What's that? Yeah, similar to that, I guess. Does anybody know the legal term that was used? Maybe you've heard of it. Crimes against humanity. Yes, you got it.
I took Holocaust and genocide class.
Crimes against humanity. Because what they were saying was, we don't care what your law was in Germany. The law above the law says this is wrong. And you're going to be found guilty of crimes against humanity. Now, of course, this is an extreme example, but this is a great illustration of the law above the law. Because technically, they were innocent. They were not guilty. Because they changed the laws to allow this. Clearly, those are unjust laws. The Nuremberg laws are unjust laws. But again, there has to be something above the law. Otherwise, this is legal. There's nothing wrong with this. If there's no law above the law. So this is a serious thing to think about, that there has to be some basis for law, because this could happen. And it has happened in other countries too. I mean, obviously Germany is maybe a very extreme example of it. But yes. And so King goes on to write that what he has started to see, and this is what, I think you'll find this part of the book, the part of the letter, really, really interesting. You would think that his perception of the civil rights movement was, we have got to address the KKK and the white supremacists and the racist, mayor and governor of these states. Those are the enemies. But actually, that's not who he was addressing this to. The real enemy wasn't those people. Because he knew where they stood on this issue. He knew that they were racist. He knew that wasn't the problem. What he did know was that there were a large number of white people and pastors of white churches who stood idly by and let it happen, who didn't stand up against this. Just like churches in Germany didn't stand up against the Nazi onslaught. The Lutheran Church, part of the Lutheran Church, which split, didn't stand up against what they knew was going on. And so King rightfully points to the church. That's why the letter was written to pastors. That's why the letter was written to clergy. It wasn't written to the mayor of Birmingham or the grand wizard of the KKK. He knew where they stood. He knew where their view was. He was writing it to the church, to the clergy, and to people in white churches saying, where are you? Why are you not standing against this? That's the group that he was most disenfranchised from. And then he goes on to make some really interesting, and I won't spend a whole lot of time on it, I'll let you read some of it, but he talks about how to understand what was being taken from black Americans at the time. And the fact that because their actions, sitting in protests and sit-ins, were precipitating tension, doesn't mean they should be the ones blamed for causing problems, because they're just trying to achieve their civil rights. And he gives some great examples. He says it would be like putting somebody in jail because they carried money in their pockets, and when somebody tried to rob them, the criminal got injured. And so we're going to put the guy who had money in his pockets in jail. Because if he didn't have money in his pockets, the guy wouldn't have tried to rob you. He gives great analogies like that show the logical absurdity of the arguments that people were making against the civil rights movement. Right? And he goes on to say society must protect the robbed and punish the robber. Now, of course, in his case, the robber was the government taking away their civil rights, preventing them from executing their civil rights. And again, it's just too much to talk about, in this amount of time. But he gives some great illustrations and some great examples of why this is a just movement. And then he goes on to talk about extremism, because they kept calling him an extremist. They're like, oh, dude, you're an extremist. Why are you such an extremist? Like, what's going on? Just be patient. Eventually, the black people will get their civil rights. Why are you pushing stuff so much? And he goes on to talk about what it means to be an extremist. And he actually writes some really interesting paragraphs about using examples from the Bible about how there were extremists in Scripture. Talks about Jesus being an extremist for love. Talks about people being extremist for justice, wanting a just outcome in a situation. And he says, so look, the question is, not are we going to be extremists, but what are we going to be extremist for? What are we going to be extremist with? And so part of this that we have to look at for our own example, our own lives, is do we just accept unjust things because we don't want to be bothered to get engaged? Or are we supposed to be extremists in the sense that we need to stand up against injustice or unjust behavior or unjust laws that we see? And he gives very good arguments for why we should be extreme. Again, I use the word extremist in quotes, but he even says in the letter, he says, at this point, I've been called an extremist so many times, I'm actually finding a measure of comfort in that word. Like, it's actually making me feel good, because he says, I know that what we're doing is correct. And so I don't mind being called an extremist, because he was an extremist for justice, an extremist for love. And he talks about the nature of being an extremist, but toward a good outcome, toward a good end. And then he absolutely goes on to lambast the church and all of its terrible failings. And again, I won't read all of this, but he basically is saying, I'm terribly disappointed with the church. And this is a pastor. This is a pastor. And he says it killed him to see how the church was so ineffective and so, I'm not even sure what the right word is, feckless, just so ineffective in addressing these problems. And he said it hurt him greatly because he loves the church and he wants to see the church flourish. But the church is not being what it needs to be, is basically what he was saying. And he gives lots of really good examples for what he saw. And he saw this sort of what he called this unnatural separation of body and soul, treating people as though they are things and not made in the image of God, right? In this case, the black community. Not treating them as humans, not treating them as equal human beings of equal worth with all other humans. And this is kind of the basis of natural law theory, right? That we're made in God's image, and that's where we derive our value from. That's where we derive our worth from. That no matter what our skin color, no matter what our hair color, no matter if you have gray hair like me, we all have equal value in the eyes of God because we're made in God's image. And he was pointing to that as the basis for God's moral law, the natural law, or as I think Christian said, the eternal law, right? God's eternal law. And so one of the things you'll take away from this, I hope when you read it, is sometimes it's okay to be countercultural. There are times when it's okay to be countercultural. If culture is going in a direction that goes against God's commands, that goes against God's precepts, that goes against what God would want. And I would hope, if you've been around long enough, you've seen examples of where our society is doing a lot of things that are either directly or indirectly conflicting with God's word and God's commands, right? It's okay to be countercultural in those instances. If it's something that displeases God, it should displease us. And we should stand respectfully to take action against it. we're called to do that. It's actually a moral imperative, and King talks about the fact that we actually have a moral duty, a moral obligation to stand against unjust laws that don't square with God's eternal law. He even goes on to say that we're actually sinning if we don't, because God has given us these moral laws, and it is our job to represent those to society. And if we just turn a blind eye when we see unjust, immoral, or things that are happening against God's law, and we don't say anything, then we're a part of the problem. We are part of the problem. And so that is the command, to be countercultural. So I did this 2 years ago in my class, because I did this letter, like in some of my previous classes. And now again, recognize that most of those students are not Christians. They're not believers. And I said, well, how many of you, if you were alive in 1963, how many of you would have marched with Dr. King and the freedom fighters and gone to Washington, D.C.? How many of you would have gone and been put in jail like they were? And almost every hand goes up. And I say, okay, well, let me ask you this. Give me an example of something you've done recently that goes against culture. Because this was very countercultural in 1963. Very countercultural. Extremely countercultural. So give me an example of something you've done that is countercultural today. What have you stood up against that goes against the culture? Not one response. And so I said, I don't think any of you would have been there in 1963. Because this was countercultural in 1963. And if you aren't willing to do something countercultural today, what makes me think you would do something countercultural in 1963? It's easy to look back in history and raise your hand. Yes, I would have stood with King. But we have the benefit of foresight. But that's not what's relevant here. What's relevant is today. Are you willing to stand up and do something that is countercultural, that goes against God's moral law, that is unjust? Because if you're not, then you'd have been just like most of the white people in Alabama at the time, doing nothing, saying nothing, letting it go by. And that's part of the problem. As believers, we're called to stand against injustice and unjust behavior. And that was what King was saying here, be countercultural. And he was so disappointed that so many people in the church, including the clergy of many of these churches, were conformist. They were just going along with what the societal norms were, and not standing against something they knew was wrong, that they knew was unjust. And then he goes on to say that, he talks about it being a heart matter, that we want to do the right thing for the right reason, right? That it's really a matter of the heart, where our heart is, and we recognize our sinful nature as humans when we look at ourselves. But we also want to recognize that we're called to stand against these injustices. So how does this apply today? How does this apply today? King talked about and spoke of what's known as natural law theory. The theory that in ethics and philosophy that human beings possess intrinsic value that is based on their reasoning, behavior, and we would say in the nature being created in the image of God. That's the basis for our value and our worth. So if we are working or involved with a young child who has Down syndrome or has some sort of debilitating illness or sickness, do we just conclude, well, not really human? Because, after all, they can't function like everybody else. I hope not. I hope we would say, regardless of their mental capacity or their physical abilities, they're human. They're made in God's image. And they are of equal value to us, to everybody else in this room. And he talks about evaluating your own behavior. Are there areas of your life where you're making an unnecessary distinction between body and soul? In other words, think of things in your life where you might be viewing people only from the physical, bodily, material perspective and not recognizing their eternal perspective, not recognizing their eternal worth, and recognizing that there is no distinction in the Christian worldview between body and soul, right? Because we are one, we are a soul with a body, right? But I challenge you to think about that. Are you kind of treating people like they're just matter, like they're just material? Are you treating them like things and objects and not people, not humans, not persons created in God's image? Because that's obviously what was happening here in 1963. Now, hopefully that's not the case anymore, but there may be other areas where we're thinking of other people in a way that would not honor their humanness and their being created in God's image. And he called us to address that, to think about that. And again, I think you can find, other than the Bible, I think you really can't find any better illustration of this than in the documents that founded our country. Right? This is where they got it from. They got it from the biblical concept of natural law theory, God's eternal law. And of course, King was pointing to this saying, hey, how come this doesn't apply to us, the black people? How come we don't have the same rights as other people? Y'all aren't living up to your own documents. You're not living up to your own laws. And he was right. They weren't living up to their own laws because they weren't treating all people as being of equal value or equal worth and deserving equal protection under the law. But yet all of us were created in the image of God and have worth and value based on that. So, this is what America looked like in the 1950s and 60s, mid 60s. Would you stand against this? Talk about an unpopular thing to stand against. Talk about being countercultural. Think carefully about what you see in the world today, because there are still things going on, even in our modern 21st century society, that I think, based on what I read in King's letter, that he would say that is unjust. Even though it's exceptionally popular and accepted in today's society. I think he would say that. And in fact, I know he would because he comes out and talks about segregation in very harsh terms, about it destroying the body-soul relationship. So just in case you didn't think there was anything out there, there are things out there. There are still things out there in our society that need to be addressed, that need to be stood up against. This is just one of them. But yeah, we have not arrived. There's still a lot of work to do. And so I want you to think about that as you go forward, as you carry on with your activities in school and life. Look at what you're seeing and ask yourself, is it squaring with God's moral law? And if not, what am I doing about it? What action am I taking? How am I thinking about this? Because as believers, we know the truth. We know we are called to do that. And it's not easy. I say it like it's easy. It's not easy. It's very unpopular to do these things, or it could be very unpopular. Okay, we're right at 9 o'clock. What questions do you have? I know we took questions sort of as we went. Any questions? Any other questions? I know it's 9 o'clock. We went a long time. Okay, so who wants me to buy them a copy of this book? All right, seriously. So all right, here you go. Here's what I want you to do. Here's what I want you to do. Seriously, I'm not making this up. You send me an email. I'm going to put it right here. Zino J at uncw.edu. You send me an email, and I will send you a book. I'm completely serious. You send me an email, I'll send you a book. That's how it works. But when you send me an email, tell me how you want me to deliver it to you. Like mail it to your house or show up in class or whatever. Yeah, or at Ratio or something. So right there, send me that email, send me an email, and I will send you a book. Seriously, I want you to read this. You need to read this. This is one of the greatest pieces of literature in the 20th century. You need to read it. Okay, questions, comments? All right, Christian, you want to pray for us and we can be dismissed? Oh, yes, ma'am.
I have a comment.
Yeah.
I think there are many, many parallels between what we were discussing tonight
Yes.
and the current state of abortion. I would like to, there's 60, according to the Guttmacher Institute, there's 63 million babies who have been murdered through the act of abortion. Over 63 million. And it's very, I think, culturally accepted that abortion is not murder.
Yep.
And so I would like to challenge the Christians in the room. When was the last time you asked someone their thoughts on abortion and challenged them?
So, if we think abortion is murder, then obviously that would violate one of God's commandments, yes. But when people think abortion is okay, why do they think it's okay?
Because they don't recognize the personhood of the baby.
They've made an unnecessary distinction between body and soul. It's just a clump of cells. They're treating people, humans, like material, like matter. And I'm telling you, King talks about that right in here. It's the same thing that was happening here in the 1960s with black people. It's the same thing that happened with Jews in Germany in the 1930s and 40s. Hitler said they're not human. It's the same thing. We're making the same mistake. We're making the unnecessary distinction between body and soul. And yes, I would agree with you. That is absolutely something as a Christian we should stand against. No doubt about it. Yes?
I'd actually argue that some people who are for abortion are a bit more insidious in that. For example, if you're pregnant with a child with Down syndrome,
Oh, yeah.
that child with Down syndrome is just going to suffer in this world. Or, that irresponsible person is pregnant, so she shouldn't be having a baby. She'll just make the baby's life hell. And they'll just justify it. The baby should be aborted for their own good. So there's stuff like that.
It's hard to believe what humans are capable of rationalizing, isn't it? Yep, it absolutely is. So yeah, yes.
I think I'm kind of jumping off that topic.
That's okay.
Or rather further.
Yeah, you're good.
The self-reflection piece of it. I think one of the things that was most impactful for me when I realized is that I was at least guilty of doing the exact same separation of body and soul. Where I found somebody with a different viewpoint than mine.
Oh, yes.
It immediately became a project and not a person.
I'm telling you, we can fall into that as Christians. I fall into that with atheists because atheism just blows my mind. Like, how does this person think there is no God? And it's hard for me to not treat them like a project, like a thing. And I have to recognize, human, made in the image of God, they just happen to have some bad ideas. And so we have to help them see where their bad ideas are. But you don't do that by calling them names and yelling at them. You do it by engaging, Socratic method, asking questions, dialogue, helping them to think. And then of course, obviously, we're not saving anybody. The Holy Spirit is. God is reaching people, but we have to be the conduit to that. But no, I agree with you totally. I see it today with politics. Republican, Democrat, everybody's the enemy, right? It's terrible, yeah.
What do you think about transgenderism where theoretically a person is separating their own body?
Yeah, again, I don't think it matters if you're separating it or somebody else is separating it. I think you're making an unnecessary distinction between body and soul. So I would say that is something to engage with discussion on somebody about and that's a very popular cultural topic for sure. Good discussion points, very good discussion point. But yeah, I would say I would put homosexuality in that category. transgenderism. There's a lot of things we see today in society. Yeah, Tom.
Book recommendation.
Please, there you go.
Love Thy Body by
Nancy Piercy, yes.
About this material, immaterial dualism.
Yes,
and
yes.
She traces it through abortion, through sexuality, through everything, and says that whenever you hold this
Dualistic view. Yep.
insidious things.
Yeah.
Piggyback off that, Irreversible Damage by Abigail Fryer.
Oh, I've heard of her, but I haven't read that book. Okay. I read Piercy for sure. I love that book. There's lots of good resources out there. There's a lot of good resources out there. Yeah, Christian.
I kind of want to revive one of Jack's objections, if that's okay.
Oh, yeah, please, come on.
Would you agree that, like, one of the ends of natural law is human good, like the natural law?
So I would say good being defined as that which is consistent with God's nature or God's will or who God is as a person. Goodness itself. Yes. Correct.
So couldn't we say Hitler, just to go at the analogy, is aiming at human flourishing, but has just defined human and collective differently? Like he's defined out.
Yeah, I would agree. He's defined good differently, and so he's aiming for what he thought was good, but it doesn't square with the ultimate eternal good, which is, of course, God.
He's trying to artificially
Yeah.
carve out.
Sure. And his beat.
Nitpicky, I just-
Yeah, no, you're right. And look, I mean, if you read on, I'm a big World War II buff. I mean, Hitler was really big with wanting to get rid of Christianity and wanting to make himself the savior of Germany, almost like the Jesus of Germany. There's a whole book on like the Aryan Jesus, right? Oh my gosh. So yeah, he was making himself God in effect, right? Yeah.
When you posed the question earlier about what laws are based on or what they're trying to achieve, were you asking what should we base our laws off of, or were you asking what are laws based off of?
I would say,
Because I understood your question as the latter.
yeah, I would say what ought they be based on, but many times they're not. Or not many times, sometimes they're not. But yeah, I would say what ought they? In a perfect society, which of course doesn't exist, all laws would comport with God's ultimate eternal moral law or God's nature. But of course, they don't, because we're fallen creatures.
I'd also say it's literally impossible to talk about a civil law without invoking a moral law.
I would agree.
Like, even if you do have the wrong moral behind it, any law you come up with,
Yep.
when you're asked, like, why that,
Yep.
you're going to say a moral law. So there was this big thing about, like, you can't institute morality, but that's literally all that a law is. Even some nitpicky is, like, laws around, like, Bitcoin or something. Like, as to protect against fraud or the like, so even if people aren't one to say that we're trying to institute morality, you literally can't talk about the law and why it matters without invoking the moral law. Now, that moral law might be like 2 or 3 levels deep,
Yeah.
but you're eventually going to get like prevent fraud,
Yeah, if you keep asking why, well, we shouldn't do such and such. Why? Well, this. Okay, well, why that? Oh, well, this. Well, why that? Eventually, you'll peel back the onion and get to the ultimate standard, the eternal law. Yeah.
Yeah, to agree with that, I think that, you will always find some kind of moral basis behind any given law in society, because it is my understanding that we can never achieve an ought from is. So we can
Correct.
never say that we ought to do this,
Right.
this is this way.
Correct.
It's always based on the law.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
if we ever have any kind of law, like we ought to do this, we ought to structure society this way, because all laws are oughts.
Yep.
Doesn't sound like a word anymore, but
Yep.
there will always be a moral basis behind decisions.
Right. And that's the problem with rejecting moral law or natural law theory is you're trying to derive an ought from an is. Like, well, we ought to do this because that's the way it is. Well, no, that's not at all. That's no basis at all for an ought. Oughts stand on their own because they refer to the ultimate law, God, right? Is what it is, but we are aiming for ought, right? But those, yeah.
When it comes to following God's law, it seems that the same philosophical rule applies. So we ought not murder because God says we shouldn't murder. Now that's an ought from an is,
Well, no, we ought not murder because, not because God said it, but because it is inconsistent with his character.
Correct. So it seems that if we, even in that instance, when we're following the will of God,
Mhm.
it's still, we're deriving an ought from an ought.
Yeah, I mean,
Kind of a paradox, it seems.
well, I mean, the ultimate ought is established by the eternal law of God, right? So there is no standard above God, right? God is the standard, right? And so our oughts derive from him. So God doesn't go, what law ought I make here? No, right? That would be deriving an ought from an ought, but that's not how it works. God is the law. He is the standard. So our ought is derived from him. His just exists. There is no ought for him. It just is the way he is. That's his nature.
So could we fairly say that that there is some evidence for God's existence if there are any moral oughts in the first place? Because
Correct.
there must be a base ought.
Great argument, great discussion for an atheist. Find something an atheist is passionate about. You ought not be a racist. You ought not and ask them where did they get that ought from? And they're going to be like, I think that's just right. Well, how did you come up with that? Because they have no basis for their ought, because in their view, there is no standard outside of humans. So yes, exactly. That's a great question to discuss with non-believers. Because they're coming up with their oughts from somewhere. They're just not pointing to the ultimate standard because they reject the ultimate standard. But yet, they're some of the most fiercely argumentative people about what you ought do and ought not do. They're pretty clear on things that you should and shouldn't do, but yet the basis is just their own view. It's just themselves. So yeah, it's a great point. That's a very good point. And that's a good way to engage people as believers with unbelievers, for sure. Yeah, for sure.